Hey guys, in today's video we're going to be going over Introduction to the Critique, and we're going to simply be talking about the parts of a critique, how to use a critique, and what a critique's purpose is in LD debate. There's going to be a lot more complex videos in the future about a lot of the nuances and technicalities of how to debate critiques, but for this video it's a basic introduction of what is a critique and how to understand it. So the first thing to understand is that there are four parts to a K is what is referred to. The first part is the link. And the link is a lot different than what debaters think it necessarily is in traditional debates. The link is different from a disad from X leads to Y, i.e. X being what the affirmative does, that leads to Y is bad because of this reason. The link to a critique is not X leads to Y, but the starting point of X is problematic in and of itself. This translates to, it is not only about what the AF does, it is about what the AF assumes. So in a traditional type of critique, I'll pick one of the most simplest ones, called legalism. In a legalism critique, basically the branch of literature of legalism is questioning the starting point of the law and questioning sort of the ethical nature of the law being good or bad in the first place. So if the affirmative were to fiat a policy, and we'll get a lot more into what fiat is and how to understand what fiat actually means, but if the affirmative implements a material policy in a hypothetical world and says this leads to good impacts for whatever reasons, a legalism critique would question their starting point of the government, which means it's not just necessarily that they are using the government, but the assumption of the affirmative is that using the government would be a productive mechanism to reach the impacts that they want to reach in the world of the affirmative, which is what the link is at that point. It is not only about using the government, but it's about trusting sort of the ethicality of the government to actually be productive in doing whatever the affirmative wants to accomplish. So again, a link is not only what the AF does, it is about what the AF assumes and why that assumption is problematic. The second part to a critique is the impact. So the impact to a critique is a little bit different from an impact to a disad or from an impact from like a case turn or something other than a critique argument. An impact is more understanding the justifications for why their assumptions are problematic. So, continuing off of this legalism example, if using the government is bad, to trust it. That is our link. The affirmative trusts the government to be a productive mechanism to lead to their impacts. The impacts on the critique would be why legalism is problematic in and of itself, why the government is problematic, what the affirmative justifies. So, it is why what the AF assumes is a bad idea. If they assume the government is productive, an impact to a critique, for example, would be something like false trust within large structures of power. And this is an impact because when we constantly trust the government to do something productive and the government never ends up doing that productive thing, it leads into a sort of false hope and false trust that can cause psychological violence sometimes, that can cause people to trust in an entity that they probably shouldn't trust in. And then obviously the negative debater has to do impact comparison and impact weighing for why this impact either turns the affirmative case or outweighs the affirmative case. But on a basic level, that's what an impact would look like. Same thing for a capitalism critique, which is just a criticism of the entire structure of capitalism. The link would be the affirmative operates in a capitalist mindset. The impact would be, oh, capitalism causes climate change. This is not necessarily the affirmative is causing climate change like a disad would be from X to Y, but it is rather the affirmative's mindset and assumptions are what justify the horrible impacts from our critique, i.e. when they are stuck in a capitalist mindset, an impact of that capitalist mindset is an eventual climate change or eventual mass destruction or social inequalities or something like that. So the impact is why what the AF assumes is a bad idea and justification for how that is problematic. The third part is the alternative. This is the part of critique debate that is probably undercovered and not understood as well as it should be, and it is a simple way of understanding what the affirmative does and how the negative is opposed to that. Simply meaning, if the affirmative is legalistic, and we have read a legalism critique, a negative alternative can be as simple as reject the law. Obviously, this is not the most specific alternative, and it is not the most tangible alternative, but a distinction to understand in critique debate from other debates is that alternatives are not supposed to be fiated, i.e., they're not supposed to be a tangible implemental policy that competes with the affirmatives policy, because that's not what critiques usually are. Critiques usually are criticizing larger structures and assumptions of the affirmative that they would not fiat using those same structures, or would not fiat in general, because alternatives are more about mindset shifts. If you try to fiat an alternative, it becomes very hard and problematic, because how are you going to fiat mindset shifts changing? Which is essentially an alternative. Whether it's reject capitalism, whether it's endorse historical materialism, which is like a method of rejecting capitalism, whether it's reject legalism, these alternatives are very vague, and we'll get into more videos for why it's okay for them to be vague, or why there's a strategic value for them to be vague. But the vague nature of these alternatives are essentially, we shouldn't do the affirmative. We should change our mindset from a different mindset, which is legalistic, towards legalistic, maybe like anarchist. And they have a lot of different authors who have spent their life criticizing a lot of these ideologies, and why we should have alternative ideologies in order to fight back the way in which particular assumptions dominate different understandings of the world. So an alternative is how the neg plans to solve the problems it outlines. So if you outline problems of capitalism, outline problems of legalism, your alternative needs to be a method in which you solve for those problems and you solve for the affirmative problems. A quick way, we'll get into this a lot later, but a quick way to solve for the affirmative problems is something called the root cause. And not to get into it too much, but if the root cause of the affirmative's problems is capitalism and the alternative rejects capitalism, this is a way the alternative solves the affirmative, is because it is rejecting the mindset that continues the affirmative's problems in the first place. And that's just one example of how the negative is able to use an alternative to solve the affirmative and solve its own problems. The final part in the critique that is very misunderstood and not used enough, sadly, is framework. And all arguments need framework, right? Arguments are nothing. Extinction impacts don't matter unless they link to a particular type of framework. And the reason we need a framework is because you can't just have a claim, warrant, and impact without understanding what those impacts actually link back to. So whether it's a value or value criteria or some other method of framing the debate, there always needs to be a framework, and that does not exclude critiques. Critiques also need to have a framework. It's not enough to just call out the affirmative for being capitalist without understanding or giving the judge a method for understanding why is capitalism bad in the first place. So the framework is traditionally constructed in a critique. It doesn't have to be like this, but usually it's constructed as ROJ, which is role of the judge, and ROB, which is role of the ballot. It's easy to think about these two sort of like a value and a value criterion. If a traditional value would be morality, a value criterion would be maximizing welfare. Why do we want to maximize welfare? Because we want to access morality. And that's how the value criteria links to the value, and that's how the value criterion is a method of achieving morality. The role of the judge, say in its most simplest terms, is to be a critical educator. All of that means is that the way the judge should orient themselves in the debate is to be critical about what the affirmative is saying, which means if the affirmative says the sky is blue, don't just simply accept that, but question a lot of the underlying premises and assumptions for the foundational claims that the affirmative actually makes. Which means the role of the judge, if it's to be a critical educator, the critical education can be looked at as a value. At that point, there needs to be a way to achieve that critical education. That's where your role of the ballot comes in. Your role of the ballot is saying that the ballot shouldn't go to whoever wins or loses. The ballot should have a specific method of understanding what this debate actually means, and that's who the ballot should go to. So if the role of the judge is to be a critical educator, and the role of the ballot is to endorse the debater who provides the best methodology to interrogate capitalism, then if I win a link to my critique, and I overall win the critique in the debate, I'm winning that I win impacts back to the role of the ballot, because if the role of the ballot is about interrogating capitalism, the capitalism critique, if I win my alternative, is the best way in order to interrogate capitalism. Which means the role of the ballot is essentially supposed to be a framing mechanism for how to understand how offense is filtered. obviously people are allowed to give counter role of the judges and counter role of the ballots, and you should accept those and be willing to debate those and debate and do weighing arguments for why your role of the ballot may be better or why you link into their role of the ballot. But essentially the role of the ballot is just, what does the ballot mean? It's not just a win or loss. It's what the ballot represents in a larger nature, whether it's literature about legalism or capitalism. It's one brand of literature that is put onto the ballot in order to understand how the ballot operates. The role of the ballot also can go into a lot of different theories of debate, like performance debate, where the role of the ballot is about performance and not just simply about hypothetical implementation of the plan. And that's where critical debate becomes a little different, because critique debate is not just simply what the affirmative should do or should not do, but rather the way in which we engage in this particular debate space. And obviously we'll do a lot more videos on that in the future of what performance debate is and how to understand performance. But in general, a critique is understanding you need a link about what the AF does, and not only what the AF does, what the AF assumes, the impact for why this assumption is so problematic, the alternative for how the neg plans to solve the problems it outlines, and a framework to understand how the link, impact, and alternative actually are framed, which would be a role of the judge indicating how the judge should orient themselves, and a role of the ballot, which is that the ballot does not mean W or L, but the ballot represents something larger, i.e. an interrogation of capitalism or legalism. If we win our critique and that links to the role of the ballot, that's why you should vote negative. So I hope that helped. There's going to be a lot more videos in the future about how to understand a critique. Please leave any suggestions in the comments for any future videos you have on different parts of critique that you want explained, or different aspects of critique debating that you want. And we will see you in the future with many more videos. Thank you for watching, guys.